Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Sorry, I'm just checking I'm not on mute. That would have been a schoolboy error, wouldn't it? I think many of you have been here before, but for those who haven't, welcome to the next in our series of lottery-funded webinars called Routes to Success. We're running these basically to support youth workers in their practice while we're going through lockdown, while we're going through the COVID crisis. There isn't much housekeeping to do because you're in your own houses. And so I won't do the same joke about what happens if there's a fire. You know well what to do if there's a fire in your own home. So we'll crack straight on. Today's is, the title of today's is called Responding to Youth Violence Through Youth Work. And we've got Craig Pinkney along to talk us through that. So I'll hand straight over to him. And, oh, hang on a sec. No, there's one other thing. We will be recording the webinar for broadcast on our website. So if by any chance you don't want your face to be recorded, please leave your camera off. And if you don't want something you say to be included in the edit, if you just let me know in the chat, then I can edit it out. That'll be fine. Otherwise, it will be recorded and put on the website in its entirety for people to dip into as and when they want. Right, so enough from me. I'll hand you over to Craig, who's going to take us through the next hour and a half. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And good afternoon and welcome to everybody that's in the room. We don't have a lot of time, so the way that I like to do things is go straight into it. Just to kind of just put it out there, one of the things that I kind of like to do is the first segment of the webinar, I'll just kind of convey some information, and then the second half, or the last quarter, should I say, of the webinar, then I'll open the floor for Q&A, and Kevin will then read some of the messages in the chat. So if you want to ask me a direct question, if you can reserve it towards the end, and if you can type it in the chat facility, and then that will be answered to my best of ability. If I can't, then we may need a follow-up conversation following from that. So, as you've heard, the webinar this afternoon is called Responding to Youth Violence Through Youth Work. My name is Craig Pinkney. You've probably heard the accent already. I'm from Birmingham, the West Midlands. I go by a number of titles depending on what it is that I'm doing throughout the week. But I guess these are some of the fancy ones that I'm kind of known for. So my background is in criminology, specializing in the area of youth violence, youth crime, extremism, and child exploitation. I am also a youth worker, JNC youth worker of 17 years. I've worked in a range of different settings, whether that be centre-based, outreach, detached. I've done some work in pupil referral units, child secure, residential care, anywhere where you find young people, really. I've had quite some interesting experiences nationally and internationally. I'm also an academic. I previously was lecturing at a university for about 6.5 years, where I taught criminology, criminal justice, offender management, youth and community development, youth and community studies, research methods, and developed a bespoke program called Responding to Youth Violence. I'm also a PhD student. On my second year into my studies, and I think studying at the minute is just so difficult with Zoom and adapting to Teams and all of these new ways of learning. So it sounds quite hypocritical that we're all here trying to learn today on a space like Zoom, but I promise I'm going to try and make it as interactive, as fun as possible. I'm also an advisor nationally for a number of entities. So I currently work with Norfolk County Council's Children's Services. I work for a number of, should I say, in conjunction with a number of violent reduction units. So Nottingham VRU, as well as West Midlands VRU, Police and Crime Commission in the West Midlands, National Crime Agency, and also support the National Youth Agency within their work around research. And I guess one of the kind of key things that I always say in terms of my slogan is that I'm all about bridging the gap between academia and the streets. So having that frontline experience working with young people and some of the most high-risk young people in our country, but also having that opportunity to kind of develop my understanding through the literature and enabling to kind of strike that balance. And I think one of the kind of titles that I also like is that I'm a dad, because sometimes we wear our professional hats on 24/7, and sometimes we kind of forget that, you know, we're parents, we're aunties, uncles, we're grandparents. And I think that these things are just really important to kind of just acknowledge, because a lot of the issues that we talk about are issues that not only impact our young people that we engage, but also potentially some of our families too. And I think, you know, just to kind of move forward, you know, these are some of the writings that I've done. At the end, I will give you a link to my website, so you can see some of the publications that I've done and supported, especially a couple with the National Youth Agency. So even the one responding to youth violence through youth work, even in the Q&A, there may be parts where you want me to clarify, but we may not have enough time. You can go to the National Youth Agency website and you can see that publication, which kind of reflects all of the models that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So now I think I have your attention. I hope you are paying attention. You've locked everything off. You've hid the dog and the cat away. Your children are at home irritating you, and you've told them they need to be quiet for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. So we can go straight into the information. And I guess one of the interesting things that I guess has happened over the last month is that we as youth workers or youth work practitioners have been challenged with an array of things. And I think that one of the key things I think is I think quite poignant, and I think that's out there, is, you know, the fact that we've been under a pandemic, we've been under a varied series of lockdowns. And the question is, you know, how are we as youth work practitioners able to engage young people at the level that we are frequently used to knowing? And I think part of those challenges ultimately has really kind of impacted the way that young people mobilize, the way that young people connect with each other, and also the way in which young people connect on an online space, you know. And I think that as practitioners engaging with young people, it's really got us to think about how do we engage with young people when we know there's so many issues that are affecting them, and the vulnerabilities of young people have increased since the pandemic. And I think one of the things that I always point out to practitioners is, are you reading? You know, how often and how frequent do you read updated literature on issues that are impacted by young people? Because there's one thing to be very passionate about the work that you do with young people, but how much do you actually know? And when I always kind of do training for youth workers or workers within social services, children's services, working with people within criminal justice, I always meet passionate workers, but then I ask them basic things like, you know, can you tell me like the most recent slang in your local area? Can you tell me about the music that young people listen to? Can you tell me about the new fashion trends that young people are connected to or interested in? And sometimes as professionals, we just don't know, but we have the passion. And one of the things that I always say is it's important that we have both. We not only have the passion to work with young people, but we will also have the intellect and understanding the world through their lens, that enables us to be more effective as youth work practitioners. And I think that starts with understanding their reality. And when we engage with young people and the research that we do with young people, whether locally or nationally, we always find young people saying that these are things that are imported or in things that are ultimately impacting their lives every single day. And just to read out a few, you know, young people say things like they feel trapped. You know, they want a sense of belonging. They just want to be part of a group. You know, they say things like they're bored. You know, they say things like, you know what, I just want to make money now. And as they say, create education is long. I got so much money I can make by doing this, or this. What's the point of going to school, or what's the point of going to college? And we're challenged by a lot of these things that young people throw at us. But I always say, what is in our disposal? What is in our toolbox when we're able to kind of respond and engage with young people in a range of different ways? And also the fact of labeling. You know, sometimes we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, and we as practitioners forget about the labels in which sometimes we give children and young people, and ignore the adverse impact of labels that we put on them and that they internalize and behave outwardly. One always perfect example that I always like to give is doing a lot of work in pupil referral units. And there's always kind of the scenario where a young person's kicking off for whatever reason, has to be restrained by members of staff for their own safety and safety of their peers and the other members of staff in the building. And I'm always fascinated to understand what it was all about. And speaking to those young people, they've said things like, you know what, it's just because I've got ADHD. That's my point. That young people like that get told things over and 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 over again, that they actually start to internalize those particular labels in which we give them. So one of the things that I think that is important as an intervention working with young people is that we reintroduce positive labeling. And if you want to know what positive labeling is all about and you want to study or role model the best positive labelers, study the world of nursery practitioners. They are the best positive labelers that in my opinion, are the best. And I challenge anybody to tell me of a positive labeler in the lives of children and young people that you see constant positive labeling that exists. And I think that these things are like really important when we talk about how young people view the world and how they see things from their lens. And I think COVID-19 has kind of come in and really demonstrated the challenges, as I've said previously, of our young people and the challenges as us as practitioners trying to engage. And I think that when we talk about the notion of violence, you know, as COVID-19 has provided that the vulnerabilities of our children and young people have increased, so has violence, so has exploitation, so has mental health, so has the anxieties of young people, so has self-harm. You know, young people are engaging in more risky behavior, and we're really starting to see a difference in the way that young people are engaging. And more importantly, the services that once were available to children and young people that are not able to engage in the way in which they once were. And as a consequence of that, two things are now happening. Young people that were known to services in terms of their behaviors that are either antisocial or criminal have increased. And now we're starting to see a spike in young people that weren't known to any services at all. And we're starting to see new behaviors amongst them that are linked to things like exploitation, violence, criminality, and so on and so forth. And when we see this particular issue, whilst the pandemic is upon us, we kind of see a cycle. And for many of you that are familiar with kind of some of the sociological ideas around the school to prison pipeline, or even in early years around the nursery to prison pipeline, the criminal justice pipeline all comes from the same root. And ultimately, when we think about and consider all of the issues that impact our young people, let's just think even in COVID-19 or before COVID-19, we can agree that our children and young people are feeling more and more alienated and marginalized. And as a consequence of them feeling alienated and marginalized, when they are trying to navigate their way in their communities, within society, one of the things that oftentimes happen that we as adults forget about is that we have become a nation of social disorganized entities. What do I mean by social disorganization? Organizations, entities, for example, schooling, the police system, statutory organization, housing, amenities that exist within communities, the resources that are not working collectively to be able to respond to the issues that affect young people, that cause them to be alienated and marginalized in the first place. And as a consequence of that, we see young people joining groups that, in our opinion, in some cases, they're deviant. In some of the cases, they're not best fit for some of the children and young people that we oftentimes know. And young people, going back to my previous point, may join some of these types of groups because they just want a sense of belonging. But as we know, because a lot of these groups are involved in criminality, at some point in time, some of those children and young people end up on that conveyor belt of involving themselves in some form of criminality. And then generally the punitive response from professionals within statutory orgs, third sector organizations, working with statutory organizations or police, is that we always put young people in one place, generally child secure or YOYs, thinking that by putting children and young people into those particular spaces, that somehow the solution to the problem is going to be resolved. And oftentimes it doesn't. And then those young people come back to the community still feeling alienated and marginalized. And guess what? The community is still disorganized. We haven't changed. So when we look at the conveyor belt of the cycle, what we find young people going in and out of this cycle, what we need to be doing is working better at being organized. And part of our organization is around communication and the way in which we trust other fellow professionals from different entities and truly working in a holistic, multi-agency way. And we utilize these terminologies all the time, but every time that there's a serious case review, after a child has been murdered, a child has lost their life at the hands of a carer or a parent, we oftentimes are faced with this conversation about sharing of information, working in a contextual safeguarding framework, which oftentimes we use the buzzwords, but we don't use it. So part of our conversation later, when we have the Q&A, we may want to talk about what social organization looks like and how we can ultimately improve in terms of our effectiveness in being able to respond to the issues affected by our children and young people. And one of the things that I've just quickly done, without kind of showing you every single book that you need to be reading to understand the context of young people as it links to youth violence, gangs, exploitation, criminality of all forms, extremism, CSE, whatever you want to talk about it, the research comes with the same conclusions. So no matter what report that you read, the only thing I would say is new is social media. But other than that, the key issues that exist within our society that we as a society don't address are the same. We don't talk about poverty enough. We don't talk about deprivation. We don't talk about the failure and the poor education our children are getting within our country. We don't talk enough about the trauma that young people experience within their households, within their communities. We don't talk about the impact of unemployment within specific communities and the lack of resources, the housing conditions of some communities. Two things that I think that we've kind of written off and we don't talk about at all is trauma and fear, the adverse impact of trauma on young people, and the fear that resonates from the fact that young people may be traumatized from the things that they observe or experience within their particular land space or their particular environment. And as a consequence of that, we as adults, practitioners working with children and young people, all we think about is an intervention. And we don't think about the impact of trauma and fear that may exist within a young person that may cause them to want to carry a weapon, may cause them to want to involve in some form of criminality or some form, or join a group that may be involved in some form of deviancy. We don't talk about institutionalized or systemic racism. It's interesting that now that we've following the murder of George Floyd, that we're now having these conversations again. But these are issues that have been around for centuries, but we're not talking about it. And it's only when a issue kind of arises, we then start to talk about systemic racism, institutionalized racism, and then we start to talk about disparity, disproportionality that exists within education, housing, healthcare, criminal justice, and we start to realize that people are being mistreated, and as a consequence of that, we see the ripple effect of that in our communities. One of the key things that I said earlier on about professionals is that we don't read. So our interactions and interventions are reactive and we're not competent. And that's not because we are not brilliant workers or have the potential to be, but what do we know? Are we still using models that were created in 1997 or 1948? Or how are we using contemporary models and how are we adapting them to the contemporary time in a mediatized technological world that young people are engaging, and so on and so forth? So we can look at all of those root causes, and if we was to go around the room right now, we would know that some of those issues that are out there are impacting children, young people, families, and communities as a whole, impacting our society. And oftentimes we only talk about the unsurfaced things, meaning the problems that we're faced with. But sometimes we just need to pay attention of, if we were only to address some of the issues of the root, we would then start to look at the fruit and how that ultimately is impacted. And I think as a consequence of all of that, youth work, you know, has always been kind of one of those things that I kind of say has always been like a hidden art, you know, a hidden science, where we as youth work practitioners are not oftentimes valued in the space of being able to respond. And when you look at history, and history is an important thing to always look at, is that when you've ever had an issue within society that affects children and young people, the idea of youth work practice has always been around to be able to respond to society's ills that respond to children and young people. And you look at, the movements that began with the church, and you look at a lot of the movements that kind of came on the back of that, the idea of being able to engage with children and young people in the way in which youth workers do and did is amazing. But the art has been lost because our understanding, and I say we in a wider sense, also meaning our government, has missed our understanding of what youth work is and how it can contribute to the way in which young people operate. And I think one of the things I think is really important is to understand where maybe the distortion comes from and what ultimately happens. And one of the key things that I've noticed within the literature, more importantly, when we're talking about the distortion of youth work or youth work practice, is one of the key things around new political agendas that sometimes distort the focus on youth violence, and oftentimes look at violent extremism and radicalization. So the focus around those particular agendas oftentimes distorts the fact and the idea and the purpose of what youth work is ultimately all about. And a lot of these punitive or these political agendas, so to say, call for more punitive measures to respond to issues around violence that increase the disparity within the criminal justice system. So you heard me talk about disparity and disproportionality of particular and specific groups within society, and all of these punitive measures that people are calling for within politics and outside politics. All it does is further create that wider gap between specific groups that are oftentimes mistreated within services. And I think as a consequence of that, we have increased distrust within communities that are oftentimes affected by violence. So when we talk about the silences that exist within community, when someone's harmed or someone's hurt within the community, and we expect the community then to respond and be supported by the police and so on and so forth, it's very hard when them same systems are the ones that are disproportionately impacting those particular types of groups. And I think one of the other things around the distortion with youth work is this kind of idea of that, smaller pots of funding aimed to engage with, young people is always about some limited type of funding with unrealistic outcomes. How many times are you aware of those organizations that are frontline working with kind of the cream of the crop young people in the community that are affected by a range of different issues, but they're getting £4,000, and we know that is not enough to be able to respond to the ills, and those unrealistic outcomes are given to organizations, and they're not able to respond to the issues that we're oftentimes faced with. And I think one of the big things as well is that, a lot of well-established organizations that generally have extensive experience in bid writing sometimes become the gatekeepers by default in those bigger pots of funding to be able to respond to the issue. And especially around the agenda of gangs and youth violence, is always generally those big organizations that generally don't have the grassroots knowledge, the grassroots links, the relationship between communities and organizations that sometimes get the funding. And then it kind of becomes like an industry. And I don't like to use that word industry, but the world of gangs and youth violence and the way in which we interact and respond to young people, male and female, that are impacted by violence, it becomes a weird type of industry. Only certain groups of companies or individuals get the access to be able to engage, when oftentimes there's a conglomerate group of individuals that are able to be able to respond on grassroots level, but they're not being used correctly, and oftentimes they're not being financed. And all of these debates that are taking place within the literature and what happens in the field in this particular space add to that distortion. And I think one of the key things as well, I think is probably come back on the agenda in discussion, is the way in which statutory organizations have moved towards this kind of idea of utilizing practitioners with lived experience opposed to using qualified youth workers. And that's added to a big distortion in terms of what youth work is, as the belief that people that have lived experience are oftentimes best suited to working with young people that are impacted by violence, youth violence in particular. Now, the debate is that yes, people with lived experiences are essential and do have a space to be able to respond or engage young people that may be on the periphery, that may be at the harsher end of being involved, but it's not the be all and end all. And whilst that focus and idea and thought process is that it's only about people with lived experiences, individuals that are trained to be youth workers, and especially J&C trained youth workers, what about them and where does that fit? So what I always say is that if we think about a notion or an idea, that it's about a bit of both. And like what I said in the beginning, it's about bridging that gap between what I call academia and the streets. Because from my frontline experiences with individuals with just lived experiences, enabling them to engage with young people, what I found is that they hit a limitation. And a limitation is generally about is that that person with lived experience has a story, and that story is impactful. However, that story is limited because it may be 10 or 15 years old, 20 or even 30 years old, depending on what that story is. But that individual hasn't been trained on how to get that young person from A to B. So what that individual lived experiences end up doing is talking about and regurgitating the same story, thinking the story is going to get that person from A to B. And on the flip side, we can look at that with an individual that is just given the skills to be able to engage with young people without the frontline experience or lived experiences, and to be able to engage with individuals without that lived experience. All of the theories that you learn at university or within a training session is not going to be able to work and be effective unless you have that experiences. And through that distortion, when people are thinking it's only one group over another, this is where the kind of art of youth work is being kind of pushed to the back. And due to that kind of lack of understanding of what youth work is, that's why it's probably been written off in terms of why youth services and youth workers are not being used to be able to engage with young people that are affected by the issues that we're talking about today in a particular type of manner, because the distortion of what youth work is. And I think that distortion doesn't help and it's not useful. And I think it's important as youth workers that when we're trying to reestablish the art of youth work, and we're trying to establish what it is that we can bring to the table, I think it's also important that we have an understanding about what it is that we're fighting. Currently in 2020, I was going to say, but 2021 and beyond, you know, what are we fighting? And one of them is about the fixed mindsets that are expressed by our young people. Just observe what you see on social media, observe what you see within the media from young people, from the lens of young people. And a lot of them are fixed mindsets that are sometimes somewhat negative. And do we blame them to an extent in the current conditions? No. Toxic masculinities, working with a lot of males within my work, this idea that being a particular way and being this kind of hyper masculine individual within a particular environment oftentimes is inaccurate, because when you have young people that want to demonstrate other forms of masculinity because there's not one, how conflicting is that for young people? So identity, we find, is a major role. And I hope that when I'm talking, we're thinking about, well, these are interventions that we need to engage. So one of the key things I'm talking about here is identity. What does the interventions around identity look at in relation to fixed mindsets, in relation to toxic masculinities? We need to readdress and understand our fight as it relates to things like systemic factors, poverty, racism, the resources, the lack of resources that impact our young people. This idea about passion versus intellect comes back again. You know, that's what we're fighting. What we want is professionals that have the passion and the intellect, not just one over another. And then we need to start thinking about systems that are not short-term, but systems that are long-term. And I think when we use the term youth violence, I think it's important that we are clear about what it is that we're saying. And when I say the word youth violence, I always say youth violence is a umbrella term to mean a number of things. When I meet a lot of professionals, or when I kind of do a lot of work in my consultancy role with a lot of individuals that are on the periphery or involved in some sort of youth violence, when speaking to professionals, one of the things that I always find is that we utilize labels to mean multiple things, but not clear about what it is that we mean. So this is just a quick slide just to kind of reiterate the point that I'm making. is that when we're talking about youth violence, if we kind of acknowledge that youth violence is an umbrella term, and that umbrella term can mean many things. And that can mean that there are some young people that are engaged in violence through the utilization of guns or knives. But those young people don't necessarily have to be gang members. This is the point I'm making. Because you may have a group of young people that don't ascribe and are involved in gang activity, that utilize knives and guns as a choice of weapon in order to engage their conflict that they're engaged in. And the problem is that when we talk about violence of young people, we always make the assumption, and I say we in a wider sense, not specifically in a group, but we make the assumption that because a young person may have access to a gun or is involved in knife crime, that it's to do with gangs. And that's the wrong way to think. Because when we think about gangs specifically in a silo, we then ignore the vast group of young people that may be violent. And I argue in my research that we live in a violent society, that our children and young people are becoming more and more violent in that same society that they live in. And whilst they become more and more violent, they are utilizing and have access to weaponry. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be a part of a criminal group or organization to be able to engage. So when we talk about youth violence, it's important that we make sometimes the distinction of what it is that we're talking about, but also to understand that there is overlaps. So yes, there are young people that are in street gangs that likewise use knives and also use guns. And it's the same thing in terms of drug wars and county lines. Not all young people that are in gangs engage in county lines. There are loads of young people that have engaged in the prison system that are not a part of a gang, but have had a successful county line and exploiting other young people for a long period of time, but they wasn't gang members, and vice versa. You may have young people that are in gangs that engage in county lines. The point I'm making is that we can't just throw everything in one boat and expect the understanding to be the same thing, because when you're engaging with young people in the field, it is multifaceted and it's more nuanced. And then we can look at extremism, whether that is religious extremism or whether it's stuff around where it's ideological driven, whether it's racial, far right, so on and so forth. So it's just important that I just wanted to kind of throw that one out there, just to kind of get us to understand when we're utilizing terminologies as youth workers, to just have an understanding of what we mean. And I guess when we talk about some of the new dilemmas, and I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute break in a moment, but I guess one of the new dilemmas, I guess, which we face amongst us as practitioners, I would say one of the biggest dilemmas that we have is social media, and the way in which social media, I would say at quite a rapid rate, has kind of hit us by a storm. And I think the youth workers that are proactive, the youth workers that engage in social media well, are the ones that are probably most effective out in the field, being able to engage. So if you are a youth worker that's observing this webinar right now, and you don't have an understanding of TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp, what else is out there? Snapchat. House parties not as used as frequent as it did in the beginning of COVID-19. But if you're not familiar with those particular platforms, or you're a person that's chose not to engage with them at all because you have this opinion of, it's just for young people. As youth workers, we always have to be mindful about those statements, because if we want to be effective individuals to be able to engage with young people and meet young people where they're at, and be able to engage with them at a level or frequency that those young people understand, we have to also be adaptable and flexible in our learning and what we enable ourselves to utilize in terms of information. So it's important, and that may be some of your homeworks, because people ask me all the time, Craig, how are you so effective with particular young people? How do you get an understanding of slang and terminology that young people use? How do you get all of this information? And I say I get all of this information solely from talking to young people. Young people are our best teachers. There is no book, there is no form of literature that's going to give you all of the social platforms, all of the music channels that young people use, all of the terminologies that young people use in different types of arenas, the fashion, that young people engage with. You need to engage with young people. You need to invest some time in understanding what these particular trends are. If you are committed in understanding the lens and the reality of young people and being able to respond in a particular type of manner. So the time is now 1:35. So I'm going to give everybody a 5-minute break in the room. And then we're going to continue with the last segment, and then I'm going to open the floor for some questions. So at 1:40, bang on, 22:02, then we're going to come back and then we're going to start. Okay? So 5 minutes. One of the new dilemmas I think is pointing to make. I think we understand that county lines are definitely, when we talk about violence that's existed amongst young people, county lines or the selling of Class A substances has definitely been a major issue. And I think in COVID-19, one of the things that you may want to just kind of acknowledge for a moment is that with the kind of pandemic and the fact that this has impacted on so many different industries, the import and export of goods, the price of cocaine and heroin has risen. So due to the price of cocaine and heroin being on the rise, that's had an adverse impact on the way that criminal groups have utilized individuals that they probably exploit in order to try and get the same amount of money that they was getting in. So what that means in layman's terms is that all drug organized criminal groups are utilizing more and more young people to be able to move the product or products up and down the country in order to keep the same amount of money that was coming in. What does that mean for the point that I'm making about the rise in violence and the rise of the issues that we're seeing within our community? As I said earlier, that the vulnerabilities of young people that are increased during COVID-19, it's important to kind of understand that there is going to be a correlation between youth vulnerability, drugs, and also violence that also may be linked to that. And I think that you heard me say earlier on about the new variable. Social media, in my opinion, is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as workers. And I think that, again, just to reiterate the point before you went on the break, it is important that we understand what social media is and how social media works. So when we talk about, what is the response of youth workers, how do we react? How are we able to engage with these issues that young people are ultimately faced by? I think that we need to start having a different counter narrative. And I think we need to start being different in the way in which we approach these issues. And I think we need to start being honest about what we are and what we are not able to do and how we're able to respond to the issues that are ultimately at hand. And when I do a lot of work with youth workers and I train a lot of youth workers, I try and get them to kind of discover their power. What are their social graces? What is it that is unique about you to be able to respond to the issues that may impact young people? So when we're talking about responding to youth violence through youth work, I always get youth workers to kind of do like a mini skill audit. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? What are you able to engage and how are you going to engage? And I think the first and foremost point is just kind of returning to our foundations and remembering what our strengths are as youth workers, the fact that we are informal educators, we're spontaneous, we just get on with whatever's going on at hand. And that is historic and has continued up until this time, that regardless of what's happening, we work in a particular way and we adapt to the current climate. We know that conversation is our most powerful tool. We know we can't force people, and any youth work will tell you, you cannot force individuals to change their lives. However, we know that through negotiation, through mediation, through our narration of the way that we articulate our points, we know that there is power in conversation. And we've always worked with this idea that we're holistic in our thinking when we're engaging with young people. So it's important that we kind of remember our strengths even in the current climate, because it's going to get even more challenging. The way that services are impacted, if you remember in 2010 and 11, when the cuts started and we were talking about the ripple effect of that's going to happen. And now we're going to talk about another wave of a ripple effect of the impact of COVID-19. So whilst we have been experiencing the spike in violence, the spike in knife crime, the spike in gun crime, the spike in issues around CCE and CSE as a consequence of the last 10 to 11, 12 years of lack of resources, now we're going to see a different effect and a different ripple effect aspect. So I think as workers, it is important that we kind of stay in tune and on the ball and understanding where we're at, because when we understand where we need to be and the challenge that are ahead, it makes us effective in our practice, even though we may be limited in our resources. And I think a lot of it is around us and being reflexive in our practice, being self-aware, you know, understanding ourselves. So it's taking that transition from being a reflective practitioner to a reflexive practitioner, where we're able to analyze, you know, the quality of our interactions with individuals, with young people, with children that we engage with, and we kind of acknowledge that our own personal well-being and our own personal growth is important to the journey and helping children and young people discover their agency. And this is what positionality is all about. So when I said the word, watch your power, you know, what are your social graces? What is it that makes you unique as a youth work practitioner? Positionality is everything. You know, acknowledging, you know, the differences, acknowledging the intersections of what you come with. So the fact that I'm Black, I'm male, I'm hyper masculine, a lot of young men that I work with, regardless of what background that they come from, they resonate with that. Versus it may be another worker that may not necessarily be hyper masculine, but are you able to identify and have a level of connectivity with the young people that you're working with? Especially if you come from a community, you understand the community, but it's also important to understand that sometimes those things also potentially can be a barrier depending on what group that you're working with. So a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about this afternoon is also about being self-reflective. It's about thinking about where do we fit and how are we best placed in to be able to work with young people that may be affected by these issues. So for example, when I used to work for Birmingham Youth Service, I realized and recognized at a particular point in my journey that working in the youth center didn't enable me to be able to engage with young people the way that I wanted to. That was a personal and reflexive moment for me, because as I just previously said, it is about well-being and understanding one's personal growth. And by working outside of the youth service and working in conjunction with the youth service, with a whole array of other third sector organizations, I felt that my passion and my uniqueness with the work that I wanted to do was best fit than being working in a center. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think sometimes we have to have those honest conversations with ourselves about how best placed do we want to be and how do we want to position ourselves with understanding the current climate. And we have to kind of acknowledge, just to bring it home again, we have to look at all of the identity and the things that make us us. So we can't rule out race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, status, because all of these things are important when we're engaging with young people of difference. And that's the reason why I kind of developed my model of on-road youth work. Some of you are familiar with the term on-road youth work, but the on-road youth work, I guess, was developed and came on the back of one of my mentors and supervisors, Dr. Martin Glynn. And in one of his books, he speaks about the notion of on-road criminology. And I felt that on-road criminology didn't fit in terms of the kind of current climate that us as youth workers were engaging young people in. And I spoke about on-road youth work to be something that really kind of encompasses the intersections between youth work practice and criminological theorizing, acknowledging that we're engaging with young people that are involved in criminality, but we're utilizing youth work practice as our strength, locating a site and critical inquiry within environments that are oftentimes urban, oftentimes disorganized, and in need for contemporary understanding. So what I'm saying is, we as youth workers need to be adaptable in the models that we have been using and use them in a contemporary space, meaning that us as practitioners are required to operate from an insider perspective. So it's important that we as youth work practitioners get on the ground, get on the floor, get connected with communities if we seek to be able to engage with young people at the level that we expect to engage them with. And through this process, we get that acceptance, that approval, that permission from sections of the community that I call Occupy the Streets. And when we're talking about effectiveness, that's ultimately what it requires. And when we're talking about models of interventions, it builds on that person-centered approach, acknowledging that young people that we engage are individuals that come with baggage, whether positive or negative. But we understand that we can't have this idea that all young people are the same, but we meet young people where they're at. When we're talking about helping young people discover their agency, discover themselves, we help them do that through their individual things that they come with, whether that is their spiritual beliefs, understanding their culture, understanding their likes and their dislikes, their company that they're amongst, their friends, their family, and also their needs that they have, whether that is physiological, whether that is their physical needs, so on and so forth. So it's a person-centered approach when I talk about the notion of on-road youth work. So for those of you that are interested in on-road youth work, and as I said earlier, if you go to the National Youth Agency website and you look for the article or the report that I wrote called Responding to Youth Work, responding to youth violence, through youth work, you will see me explain these principles and how these principles are related to our practice. And these are just the key things that I argue in my research, that if you want to be an effective worker in a local space, on the street, for those that work with young people, outreach, detached, center-based, these are the key principles. And I believe that this is not just for youth workers. I believe this can go as far as those that work with young people in education, those that work with young people in the health sector, those that work with young people in children's services, those that work with young people in criminal justice, sporting, and community as a whole. Language and behavior is important. Understanding where young people are at, understanding the words that they use, the language that they use to engage with each other, so you can meet them at that level. Dress code is important, having an understanding of fashion, understanding of where young people are at. And I think youth workers generally get that right. You know, we dress knowing that our clothing is symbolic language. And when, like, for example, working with the police, they know that the moment they come in a uniform, automatically some communities see the uniform as oppressive. And if you were to take off the uniform and engage them in your plain clothes, you're going to have a completely different type of response from the people. So we know that dress code is important. And then one of the key things I've stressed today in the webinar is this idea about knowledge. You know, but I split knowledge when I talk about on-road youth work into a range of segments. So knowledge of the agenda. This goes back to my original point about passion versus intellect. What do you know about the agenda of young people? Have you read anything contemporary about the issues that impact young people? Or are you just one of those youth workers that's just a youth worker that cares? What is your grassroots knowledge in your local communities? Do you know the key stakeholders within your local communities, the local people that you can connect to? Do you know the geography of your area, the area that you work in, the communities that you serve that may have conflicts amongst each other? What is your knowledge of history? Meaning the history between families, the people that live there, the interventions. Are the intervention that you are using, are they reactive? Have they been done before? What is your links to individuals that are doing work up and down the country that do the same role as you? What are your boundaries? What is your ethic code? Which links to my point around ethics and credibility. Because credibility, I'm sure you'll agree, as youth workers, that is probably the biggest badge that we have as youth workers. When a young person says, my man's cool, she's an all right worker, she is. Because we know that word of mouth, through when young people say things like that, it makes us be recognized as youth workers that are competent, that young people acknowledge that the work that we do with young people is important and is effective. So we have to understand the levels, what I would say. We also have to have an ethical code that we go by, and we have to stick to it. And our social capital then becomes important. And that's not what we know, but it's who we know. Our approaches, going back to my point about positionality, where you heard me mention gender. Are we aware of the different gender roles that may exist within different types of interventions? So I have to be mindful that when I'm working with young people, specifically young females that may be victims of CSE, as a male worker, I have to be very mindful of that. And my organization doesn't be one of those organizations that just because I'm the only worker, I'm supposed to then do all of the the kind of hard labor working with different types of young people. No, we recognize using contextual safeguarding, we recognize the environment and the individuals that are in there, and that is being very reflexive on the individuals that we're ultimately engaging with. So we think about our qualities as practitioners, but then we also consider how that may impact the individuals that we're working with. And then we can look at all of those different segments as well. And as I said, the article is ultimately out there if we want to have a look at. And it's funny because when we talk about, these principles, some would argue that, common sense isn't common. And it is important that we kind of just acknowledge different principles and we can learn on these particular types of things. And I think just before we kind of wrap up, because I do want to open the floor for people to share their thoughts, share their ideas, as well as ask any questions. I think some of the key things that people have asked me quite recently prior to doing this session today, that if there was one thing that if there is a number of things that I would think about or consider that I believe needs to be imported, or not the word imported, should I say, is utilized more frequently amongst practitioners that are responding to violence through youth work. What are the things that we need to be considering? And I say that one of the things is fear. We as practitioners need to start studying fear and what fear means in the lens or through the lens of young people, because fear can get young people to do some really bizarre and crazy things. I work with young people that are so scared that they're prepared to do and engage in any act of violence in order to just safeguard themselves. And this goes back to an earlier point that I made about trauma and fear, that we don't explore it enough. So if your interventions with young people in whatever capacity that you work with young people does not explore their fears, we can then understand why we're going to have a continuous conversation about what needs to be done as youth workers. I think we need to have better conversations about issues around shame, hurt, and guilt, the ego, the trigger points, what causes young people to behave the way that they do, what causes young people to respond the way that they do. So a lot of the work that I do with a lot of young people in a number of projects where I'm working in conjunction with probation and third sector organisation, is a particular project that I've been working with in Bristol. And what we get those young people to look at is the impact of this idea of respect and disrespect, and getting them to look at shame, hurt, and guilt, and getting them to be very reflexive, and getting them to look at their egos, getting them to look at their trigger points of what causes them to snap, what causes them to get angry, and getting them to kind of think of almost like a timeline of their negative behaviors and what the cause was of those behaviors, and getting them to really kind of unpack their thoughts and their feelings about why they're responding in a particular way. And it's interesting because how often do we get young people to think about themselves in that way? What we often do is tell young people, raise the awareness, and all of those things are brilliant, by the way, but we don't get them to be reflexive. So whilst we are being reflexive as practitioners, it's also important that we also think about how we can get young people to be reflexive about their own actions. We can't have this idea of that we just keep wrapping them up in cotton wool and giving them all of this information, but not enabling them to build and develop that agency that I spoke about before, to build that resilience, to enable them to be able to be critical thinkers in order for them to think for themselves. And that's what youth work is. And that's what youth work practitioners and informal education has always done. And we need to kind of remind ourselves what that art of youth work is and how that is able to engage with young people in these troubled times. You heard me say trauma. You heard me say the word ego. You heard me use the word identity. And you heard me use the word respect. So if someone was to ask me what, moving forward, Craig, what are the type of interventions that we need to embark on, that we need to bring forward in terms of our interventions with children and young people and families that are impacted by violence? These are the things that will enable us to do so. So I'm going to call it to an end. I did exactly what I said I was going to do. I was going to talk for about an hour, and the last quarter of the session, I then open the floor for everybody to interact with me to the best that they can. I'm not one of those individuals that kind of stress over the point. So once the points have been made, then I will leave you all to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. But please, in the chat facility, if you can start formulating your questions, and I will try my best to answer them to best of my ability. And if I can't, then we can have a secondary conversation after. But if I can ask Kev to come back, or you're here, thank you. Any of the questions that you want to begin to start to ask, and then we can go from there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Craig. That was excellent, really thought-provoking and very thoughtful. So yeah, no, I really appreciate you doing this. Just in addition to what Craig said, before anyone goes, we're going to do some question and answer now. But also, if before you log off, could you click on the evaluation form which Steve will put up in the chat in a bit. So before you log off, click on that, and then you can fill that in at your leisure. But we do need to fill that in to learn from it and to improve what we're doing, but also to keep the lottery happy. So yeah, if you could do that before you go, that'd be great. Right, questions. There's a question from Neil here just about recommended reading, Craig, particularly around the topic of fear in young people. You were talking about that quite a lot, and I thought it was interesting. But yeah, if there's any further reading you can recommend, that'd be great.
What I can do, I can't give you my whole book list at the top of my head at the minute, but what I can do, Kev, if I will send you a list, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing at the minute, and then if you just give me if you want to ask another question whilst I'm just kind of looking through my documents, I do actually have a list. Actually, I'm just trying to find it.
Excellent.
I have a list. I normally have a picture of.
Has anyone got any further questions, Craig? That's the only one that I've seen in the chat. There was an interesting point earlier on when you were talking about the I thought this was one of the good bits of your talk, actually, but you were talking about the reliance on lived experience for working with young people around violence. And for me, it's a wider problem, I think. It's something to do with the poor definition of youth work to people who aren't youth workers. It's something that I think we've got a responsibility to look at, to be honest. There is, amongst the wider population, this idea that if you work with young people, you are a youth worker. And I don't think we do enough to shout about the practice that you get from training, Craig. I don't know what you think about that.
I look at it from, as I said in the webinar, I kind of look at it from both lenses or perspectives, should I say. With a lot of the work that I kind of do, I train a lot of individuals with lived experiences. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them come in with this kind of notion that I know what I'm doing. I'm a youth worker. I just need to just tell my story. But I always try to get them to think about, I always ask them this question: how does your story benefit the young person? And who told you that your story is going to benefit young people? Where did that even thought process come from? Because a lot of them are in this position of they've done something wrong, or they've experienced something in their lives that they believe that that story is valuable, which I'm saying it is. But where does the thinking that it means that these young people need to hear that story? And the reason why I'm saying that is because a lot of situations where I've seen with my own eyes, I'll give one example. I was doing some work in Leeds, and we had a particular well-known individual nationally that talks about his lived experience. And then he was talking about the fact that, you know, he went to jail and he went to prison and he had shot people and people had shot him and whatever. And at the end of the session, 3 young people put their hands up. And guess what the first question was? What type of gun did you have? What type of bullets did you have? And all of the questions from the young people had nothing to do with the fact that he was talking about stay away from crime, you know, stay away from making the bad choices. All they were interested in is what type of violence and what type of weaponry was you using. So when I look at that as an evaluation, that wasn't an effective session. The adults in the room were like, wow, that was deep. But for the young people, and if we're talking about the lens of learning, the young people didn't learn anything other than you just told them about your life. And those individuals have this mindset that story is what's going to change the lives of young people. Now, what I'm saying is that story, if tailored with some clear learning outcomes and guidelines, then it would be effective. Secondly, that type of information, I believe it also should be age restricted too. I find, in my opinion, that those types of stories are generally only beneficial for young people 13 and below. The moment those young people are 13 and above, the young people I work with, they start asking new critical questions. Yeah, but how long was it when you was actually on road? 20 years ago. You've already gone, because the world's different. Things have changed. So if they're talking about social media and beef on YouTube and beef on Instagram, but your story is talking about beef on the railway 20 years ago, it doesn't even match. So the connectivity amongst the individual lived experience versus the individual that's trying to understand or navigate their way through life, there's somewhat a difference. Now, there is going to be similarities in terms of the feeling, the emotion, the expression, the experiences, the downfalls, the impact on family, the mental health, the anxiety. All of those things are important. And that's my point. If it was tailored to learning outcomes to look at the impact of mental health, the impact of anxiety, self-harming, then young people might actually get benefit out of the session, as opposed to just looking at the highlight moments of, I got shot 10 times, I survived, I went to jail, I've come out, kids stay in school and don't do what I did. It doesn't really fit. So that's why I always say individual lived experiences, bringing them through training, through youth work practice, makes them unstoppable type of workers. And that's why I said vice versa with those individuals that are, I call the bookworms of youth work. I used to say to my youth work students all the time, if you are not being proactive and going out into the community and going out and getting your fingers dirty and being a part of organizations, and stop just thinking about money and volunteering for organizations, when you finish your degree, you're going to be stuck, because you're going to want to work for an organization, and in your interview process, they're going to ask you, what type of volatile young people have you worked with in the past? And just saying that you did a couple of modules on violence, it's not enough, because I want the individual that knows how to respond to little Damien, little Billy, little Sean, little Cian, little Kirsty, that's going through all of the issues and they need responses now. So we have to have those deeper conversations. And that's why the distortion that I just believe is that when I enter into a lot of spaces, this idea of, oh, let's get that guy that spoke about the violence, or let's talk to the mom that lost their son. And I'm saying all of that stuff is important, but it's not the be all and end all when we're talking about people with lived experiences.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. I think I've heard the same training session that you have.
Just to quickly before, Kevin, before you might ask, these are just, people might want to take a quick snapshot. This is just on a Word document. These are kind of generally my go-to books when I want to kind of have an understanding. So you may want to take screenshots as well whilst I'm talking. So I'll give that a few seconds. I just feel like these books are just really good because some of them are contemporary. It just really kind of talks about a lot of stuff. Some of them are kind of biased because it's reflective in terms of my PhD, what I'm looking at. But these are generally like my go-to books, and I just kind of had them on. Oh, a couple of NYA ones.
Obviously. There's a couple of questions here about, they're interesting to me because they're about where work takes place, Craig. And they're quite different questions, but I'll ask them you both, and you can tackle them one after another. The second one is about it's about youth workers and positioning themselves on social media. So someone's asked, can you expand a little on how youth workers can position themselves via social media? Now, I'm really interested in that because, I mean, one of my passions is detached youth work. So, you know, going to where young people are. And youth work online often takes place in forums that youth workers set up. You know, we'll set up a Zoom chat, we'll set up. And I'm fascinated by the idea of detached work online. So youth workers getting involved in social or in gaming and that sort of thing. So that's the first question. Can you expand a little on how youth workers can do that sort of work, perhaps? And then the other one, which is only related because it's to do with location, but it's an interesting question. It's talking about the increasing interest in hospital interventions. Now, I've come across this where...
Red thread, are you talking about?
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
let me deal with the first one first, and then I'll
yeah.
deal with the second one.
Yeah.
So we were talking about youth workers online. I know it probably sounds a bit cliche, but I don't see the difficulty. Just get online. We have a lot of these conversations about, oh, we're not allowed to do this and we're not allowed to do that. A lot of youth workers I know have conversations about what they're not allowed to do. And when I speak to their managers said, we've never had that discussion to say that they haven't. And if we did have that discussion that youth workers are not, maybe that was like 10 years ago when that individual was the head of service and we weren't allowed to use social media then. So I know a lot of amazing detached youth work organizations in Birmingham and the West Midlands that utilize detached youth work. They do amazing things of, they do kind of like quizzes. They do like online gaming. They might have a particular game. If someone can get to this level at this particular point, there's a giveaway. And then on Wednesday, they're having a live chat about a particular issue, homelessness or mental health. And to be honest, there's going to be some young people that engage and there's going to be some young people that don't engage. But the fact that you see young people interacting, I think is a good thing. I think we worry, and this goes back to my point about safeguarding. We worry so much about, and we go so safeguarding OTT, we actually just forget logic sometimes. We can't prevent everything. That's life. We can try our best to safeguard things as best as we can. So you may have an online platform on Facebook. Turn off the comment section if you're worried about people commenting. If you're worried about pictures of young people, then when young people do projects and stuff, normally when we do youth work projects, young people sign whether they want their pictures to be displayed or not. And if not, then we respect that. Working with people in the arts, they are the best people to always kind of learn from, because you can do so many documentaries, you can do so many banners with young people talking about homelessness, mental health, and all of the issues that affect them, but you don't have to get their pictures and their faces. You can take a picture of their hands, you can interview a young person with their feet, you can get a group of young people and get a cameraman to stand in the circle and literally get their hands whilst they're speaking. But we have this thinking of, because their face is being shown, we can't do it. Or we're worried about our faces being shown. Why are we worried? We want the world to see that youth workers are brilliant. We want the world to see that you as a youth worker are doing amazing work in your field. So what are you worried about being shown on a social media platform? Now, if there's genuine issues, then that may be a separate conversation that we're having at the moment. But from my understanding, I haven't met a youth worker or youth work group that's effective. Let me just put that in there. That is not on Instagram, that's not on TikTok, that's not on Facebook, and not engaging with young people in the best way possible. And maybe it's just maybe it's a new conversation we need to have with maybe our senior leads and managers, because I can guarantee half of them are going to be like, providing that you have all of the restrictions and all of the things that keep young people safe, go ahead.
Excellent, thanks for that.
So the second one was about Red Thread, wasn't it?
Well, it didn't name Red Thread, but it talks about
hospital interventions in youth work.
In that area of practice, there is this concept, isn't there, of a teachable moment.
Yes.
I'm interested in people's perspectives.
The philosophy of what the hospital interventions, I'm with it. It makes sense. But I have to provide a critique. That's just the academic in me. So this idea that when a young person goes for a traumatic experience, I generally believe that youth workers are probably the best equipped, that when that young person opens their eyes, to have the opportunity for a teachable moment in that process of recovery. I think youth work has an important role. And if you go back to the slide that I had about where informal education is, we're holistic, we're democratic and inclusive, we use conversation, and we use all of those strengths in our positionality to be able to engage in it. I think that's where youth work can be effective in a hospital experience. My critique would be, though, is in the hospitals around the country where those interventions are used, where they don't use community, it always fails. And I won't say any location in particular, but I will say a couple of experiences where I'm going to give you a positive, I'm going to give you a negative. The positive is that young person opens their eyes on the road to recovery. And let's say Kevin walks in. Kevin says, I'm Kevin from the local community. I'm here, I work with this, I work with that. I know these people. I know these people that are in your family and whatever. That young person is going to respond a particular type of way. Now, if the young person opens their eyes to an individual that's not from their community, don't know them, and is not connected whatsoever, the young person is going to probably say, who the hell are you? And I've experienced those particular issues with particular workers in those scenarios where those workers have called me and said, Craig, we've got a young man that's come in, been stabbed or shot or whatever, and we're struggling to engage with him. And I've said, tell that young person that you're one of my friends. And that person's called me back and said, you know what? The moment I said that, that young person was like, well, if you're cool with Craig, then you must be cool. So this is my critique. A lot of those organizations don't work with the community. They only use the community at the point when there's interventions not working. That's the wrong way to think. So what needs to happen is the community needs to be used from the start until the end, because that's how you're going to be able to connect to those young people in their darkest times and moments for those teachable moments to be able to can work. It can't be the other way around. And part of, because I'm just the way that I am and I just like to give anyway, I know a lot of organizations in those scenarios where those organizations and companies that do that type of intervention, that get mass funding, that will get or ask for help from those local communities at the point when their interventions don't work, and those communities just sit feeling exploited all the time. And we have to have these deeper conversations about what the role is of youth workers are within that setting. So when you go back to the point I made about the principles of on-road youth work practice, you heard me say knowledge. And I said that's applicable for all youth workers, not just youth workers because they're in a hospital. So if I'm working in a hospital, and let's say it's in an area that's alien to where I've worked with in the past, I would make it my duty outside of the hospital to have an understanding of who's in the region and who's in the area. So when I'm talking to that young person in their darkest moment, part of my teachable moment is that that young person recognize that I'm connected to the community that they come from, and not just an individual that is thinking that because I'm a passionate and I'm a nice person, that that's enough. Because there are some young people that say, listen, I don't care how nice you are, mate. I don't know who you are, and I don't know where you've come from. And if you can't answer those questions, regardless of your talent, regardless of all of the brilliant interventions that you've learned inside out and it's effective once you've got it going, if you can't attempt to answer those first 3 questions, I don't know what else to tell you. And that's why I invest so much time in my personal life in understanding the environments where young people are from. So we can't use the word contextual safeguarding. We can't talk about wanting to be a youth worker in a local community, and we ignore the entity that the young people come from, the community. You look at any report over the last 10 years that's been critiqued of why any gang intervention or any intervention at all doesn't work with young people. They always talk about trust, sharing of information, and how communities are oftentimes brought within rooms and they're almost like being sucked from all of the statutory policing or whatever, all of their understanding of what's happening, and then they get pushed to the side when they're not needed anymore. How many community organizations feel exploited and feel robbed by the same people that are saying that they want to work in conjunction with when we're talking about partnership work around exploitation? We can go back in the history and we can look at all of the old knife crime interventions of before. We can look at when the first new gang interactions came before, and all of these organizations, this idea of consortium and everybody coming together and signing the contract of working in partnership with each other. What did the community say? We were all at the table in the first 5 meetings, but then once the funding and everything else was decided amongst everybody else, they extracted our information amongst the young people, left our credibility and integrity at stake in those communities, and those individuals disappeared in the clouds, literally. And I'm saying that that's an elephant in the room that we don't address. So before we even talk about connecting those interventions and how effective are they, we also have to talk about how effective are youth services as a whole, and in conjunction working with young people and in the communities in which we claim to serve.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think there's, again, it smacks of my contention that youth work's badly understood. I just want to add to what you said with a bit of an example. In Manchester, the Greater Manchester, the mental health crisis teams have started employing youth workers. Now the crisis teams are supposed to intervene with young people who are in crisis. You know, they're often suicidal. And the job of the youth worker is, as one of the commissioners told me, was to engage the young people and to use their engagement skills. And for me, while I'm glad of the recognition of youth work, I think that illustrates a bit of a misunderstanding, because I don't see why a youth worker is any better equipped to engage a young person in the 72 hours of that intervention than a nurse or a social worker would be. And where the misunderstanding lies is that the engagement skills of youth workers aren't, I don't think, necessarily skills. I think they're to do with the youth work process,
yes,
their engagement methods. And I think we need to shout about that. And so the hospital interventions, as you said, are kind of missing out on that process of youth work. The idea that the French have got a great word for it. You're in proximity, which means proximity with the young people. And that's something that's unique to youth work, I think, and we need to shout about it. And we also need to possibly push back a bit against interventions that don't utilize that walking with, that relationship, that getting to know. I'm just having a look and see if there's any other questions relating to
comments that I'm agreeing with
what you've been chatting to. Now, there is a question about how we speak to youth workers who don't see the need of completing an accredited course. Slightly, it's not the subject of youth violence. I don't know what your perspective is, Craig. My perspective of that is that, you know, we need youth workers who are trained, who aren't trained. We need community volunteers. That's one of the things that makes youth work richer. But I would always question why people don't want to investigate what they're called to do a little bit more deeply. You know, I don't know.
Likewise, I would. That's a red flag for me. As youth workers, we all should want to adapt and want to develop. I'll give one quick example. I was called in to do some training for a particular youth work team, but I was told prior to coming that this youth work team is very challenging, and they think they know it all. So it was a weird one. I've never been called in to do something like that before. And what they wanted me to do is basically shake the cage, because they didn't want to go on any continued professional development. But because they were part of the furniture, they couldn't just get rid of them. Right. So they needed to figure out a way that kind of got them into thinking of how beneficial it was. And you know, all I did for the first hour and a half, I did a series of quizzes, a series of challenges. And all I showed was how much they didn't know. And that's what I did. I kind of really showed them in front of their colleagues and amongst and I know it was kind of a weird one, but it was a strategy that worked in that time. But really kind of just showed them. And it was basic questions like, can you now name me one song that Stormzy has made recently in the last 5 years? You know, can you tell me, 2 drill music songs that's made the top charts? You know, can you name me 4 grime artists? Can you tell me what who the latest fashion person that Gucci has decided to use? Just basic questions that young people are talking about. You know, what's the latest challenge on TikTok and stuff like that? And it was literally like they didn't know any of the answers. So I like to push the point about passion versus intellect. So all of them are very passionate workers because they've been a part of youth work for so many, but they didn't know anything. And what I was trying to highlight for them in that session is that you knowing is just as important as you being passionate. And what about if you had both? And then I leave the ball in their court. What if you have both? What type of worker could you potentially be if you have both? Why wouldn't you want to learn? Why wouldn't you want to train? If your organization is prepared to pay for it, if you're dyslexic, we get extra support. If you're worried about writing, we can get extra support. But don't run away from the opportunity to learn more because you're fearful of something that really can actually be ironed out if you just open up and tell us what the problem is. So I would think is a big red flag when I've got workers that say that I don't feel like I need any more learning or any more training. And I'm not saying that you have to do a degree, But what I'm saying is a 1 day, 2 day, 6 week CPD doesn't hurt anyone. It only enhances your work and in your field.
Yeah, as the workforce development officer for the MOA, that's music to my ears, Craig. Thank you. Right, we're just about reaching the end of our time. So I need to thank you, Craig, for that. It was an incredibly interesting, thoughtful, and insightful webinar. So, and the comments are all agreeing with that. The people who remain here, you're the best people. You're the ones who stuck it out to the end. So thank you for you. If before there are more of these coming up, so keep an eye on the website to see which ones will be coming. I think there's another couple in the next couple of weeks.